FISCA's first webinar in a series of webinars this spring. My name is Maddie Isaacs. I'm a faculty member at Florida Gulf Coast University. I'm also the Advocacy co-chair for the Florida School Counseling Association this year. We're going to be covering quite a bit today. There's a lot of slides and a lot on the agenda. Some I will be talking about in depth. Some I'm going to leave with you to make some more research and to be more thoughtful as you go through the ideas that are in this slide. But you're going to see we're going to have to go from a definition to talking about the skill sets that people need, to talking about data, and to give you some examples and a lot of tips about how to move forward as an advocate. No matter what we do as school counselors, any advocacy we have needs to start and end with student achievement. So whether we're advocating for an individual student, groups of students, for policy or systemic change, or advocating for the profession itself, we are still focused on what we do for students and how we move the profession forward to move students forward. In order to achieve the kind of advocacy that we want for student achievement, we're going to be talking a lot about making sure that you have good data and making sure that you have strong arguments, both of which talk about student achievement. So advocacy started as an ethical obligation even before we really actively started to talk about advocacy as in a key piece of the ASCA model. The School Counseling Code of Ethics and certainly the General Counseling Code of Ethics has always had us acting in the best interest of clients and doing good. Both of those could be seen as definitions of advocacy in a broad base. So our obligations to the ASCA model and to our students is to remove barriers and to be a leader for change. I'm going to let you review on your own the next few slides, which talk to the ASCA ethical standards, and where I suggest that advocacy is actually a requirement of our standards of practice. It's also in the ASCA model. The ASCA model is a little newer, certainly, than our standards of practice and ethics, and it's in the model that we really see how advocacy fits in with the other things that we do. But we are to be leaders in promoting school reform, and that means eliminating barriers, making sure that the opportunities, there's equitable opportunities and creative opportunities. I'm seeing some comments that saying that they cannot hear but will read what we're suggesting. I'm seeing enough audio that suggests that there's one or two people. Make sure you have not muted. Make sure you have not muted your. Where Rosabella is here with me, so I have in studio technical help. Somebody just said audio just came up. Do make sure that you haven't muted your own audio. Okay, Russ has just changed some of the technical pieces on the microphone, and hopefully that will help. Just hearing better and much better. Okay. See, it pays to be broadcasting live from the studio of Russ Sabella and getting his help. At any rate, we were talking about how the model really requires us to ensure access and equitable access to opportunities and to learn, to collaborate with others inside and outside of the school to meet student needs, and to promote some kind of positive and systemic change in schools. So when we're advocating for students, we're talking very much like RTI. We advocate for one student sometimes. We advocate for and social justice on a local, state, regional, maybe federal, national, and sometimes international level. Sometimes it means identifying unmet needs, taking actions to change circumstances that are contributing to a problem or inequity. This may be in the school, it may be in your district, and it may be at the state level. We also talk about making sure that funding and policy decisions that are being made do not promote barriers to access. Right now in the state of Florida, certainly we have a very good example of where school counseling is not specifically being mentioned in funding or funding cuts, and the policy decisions that are being made in terms of educator compensation could significantly impact the job of the school counselor both now and down the road. The legislature may be making some funding decisions that get implemented at your local level that can impact whether or not school counselors will be in every school, the extent to which they will have reasonable ratios, and have access to the kinds of supports they need to support students. Russ is going to turn it down some more. We're still getting some sense that perhaps the audio is very fuzzy. And we just made that change. Hopefully that will change some of the audio quality that several of you are reporting. Being an advocate is about having the skills and the dispositions to be an advocate, okay? Dispositions are your tendencies, we're your bent, essentially. We're talking about things like leadership. We already know that counselors have communication skills. Having a little bit of courage to put yourself out front and to be available to people, to be the face of change, to be the face of challenging the status quo. Collaboration, finding good collaboration with partners inside and outside of the school. I talked before about courage, and the other side of courage is risk-taking. Being willing to take a risk, to try something new, to talk to people about things that may be hard conversations. Being persistent, having the ability to coordinate change among other people. It's not just being there by yourself. And having a bent towards altruism. We have to be disposed to wanting to do good and to be engaging our risk-taking and our courage and our collaboration and our leadership and persistence toward doing good for others, not necessarily just for ourselves. It's becoming a gambler. One of the key things that I've learned in my role as president of our faculty union, which I'm now completing my 6th year in doing that, and I've worked in grievances in some other areas and significantly in advocacy, is you have to know when to give up the fight as when to be persistent. So you have to listen to other people, be strategic in your thinking, and sometimes stop banging your head against a wall that's too hard and it's making your head hurt. All of this requires credible data. We can talk about personal stories and we can give people examples and anecdotes, and that tends to put a face on what the facts are. But we better have the facts and we better have data. One of the things that we know before, during, and after you identify critical issues for advocacy is that you need to have convincing, credible, expandable data. And by expandable, I mean it can generalize to broader situations than you are in. It's not just the exception. It could become the rule. You also need to learn how to anticipate the positions that people who are going to disagree with you, how they may be approaching this, what their concerns may be. Because part of pulling together your arguments and your data is to be able to show them that their concerns will be met, that their positions may not necessarily have the strength that they think they have. But the most important thing that having credible data before, during, and after you engage in advocacy and system change efforts is that credible data keeps you out of only arguing with people on an emotional level. And this is probably one of the greatest barriers for school counselors to become advocates, is that they tend to want to function on an emotional level, and they tend to want to pull out all the kids who are the exception to the rule, who are not getting served, who need some help on some particular issue, who have some dramatic issue. And those are important pieces, but if we don't have credible data that cuts through the emotionality of it, When people disagree with you, they begin to argue with you on an emotional basis. When you're arguing with policymakers and people who have the authority to make change on an emotional basis, and you're making them feel bad about what their position is and about what their decision is, we may have lost the war. So advocacy is based on good data because we need to use data to identify those gaps in services or procedures or those policies that are no longer really fitting the goals that we have. We need data to be able to set and create appropriate goals. And remember, when we set goals in advocacy, it's also almost predicting what some of the solutions might be. We use data to create a sense of urgency. And one of the things we can think about when we talk about data and advocacy and we talk about student achievement as our main goal, how do we look at graduation rates and the time it takes to close the gap in some areas to get kids to graduate and to be successful? How do we use that to create a sense of urgency? How long does it take for students to turn around where they may be? We use data to engage stakeholders. People tend to remember snippets of facts. If you say to somebody, did you know that X% of students in our school or in our district have not been able to see a school counselor because their school counselor ratios are 1 to 1,500, that creates a sound bite that you can talk about over and over and over again. Sometimes we use advocacy to prove the success of what we're doing and to suggest to people in a solution-focused format, if you gave us the support we needed or the funding we needed, we could be doing even more of this successful thing. Sometimes it's to say, you took a risk and we ran a pilot program. We want that pilot program to continue. We want to be funded. We want to have sufficient resources. This is what our data showed. Data is more persuasive ultimately than emotion, even though emotion sometimes feels like it may be more persuasive, because as passionate as we feel, we hope that that passion will translate to other people. But very often our policymakers are looking at budgets, they're looking at data, they're looking at trying to carve up an increasingly shrinking pie. We have to talk to them in terms of the contribution that we can make in a language that they can hear, and they hear in language of data. Data helps us challenge existing policies and practices. Certainly it serves as a catalyst for very focused action. A couple of resources that I found that might be very helpful for you to learn about using data. One is designed for journalists, actually, which is a very good analogy because journalists often have to present both facts and a slant on a story or an interpretive slant on a story. And that's the first one, robertniles.com. And the other piece has been around for a while, and it's called Damn Lies and Statistics. And you may remember that's from a quote from Mark Twain about there's certain kinds of lies. There's lies, damn lies, and then there's statistics. Advocacy is also about the profession, and one of the things we want to stress for you, certainly from the Florida School Counseling Association, is everything you do for students individually and in your schools for groups of students is really key to apply for the profession as well. So you know you're advocating when you're promoting school counselor credibility in the public eye, when you go before the PTA and you present your results from last year's stuff. You may not have a particular goal to change their mind, but you will have an effect of advocating because the next time you go to them, they're going to see you with more credibility and more authority. So when you have something to ask, they will be more likely to afford you a positive answer. When you generate and promote research on the efficacy of school counseling, whether it be a particular project or closing the gap project that you did in a small way, something on your school or district level, or you promote research and work with university faculty or other researchers for school counseling, you are advocating for the profession. When anything that you do that generates or promotes our effectiveness in the eyes of administrators, families, and policymakers is advocating for the profession. whether you have a particular advocacy target or not. You also know when you're advocating when you get to sit at the table for some school, district, or legislative policy agenda, and you provide data or information in terms of how to direct that policy agenda to make sure that we meet our goals of student achievement. When we form coalitions with other educators or with community activists, when we collaborate with families on behalf of a program or on behalf of trying to get extended opportunities for individual or groups of students, and when we collaborate with a host of outside of the school entities, both inside and outside of education, to make sure that school counseling effectiveness is considered in any policy discussion. The bottom line is that you will not be able to advocate for students if you have too many students to be effective or to implement a program, if your non-counseling duties become a barrier to effective implementation of a quality program, if you are a well-trained school counselor who has lots of good ideas, lots of good experience, and a really good program, but 90% of your day is engaged in doing things that do not allow you to implement that program, you can't advocate for students. You can't advocate for students if you don't have the appropriate professional development to keep your skills current. You can't do it if you lack representation in the reform discussions in your school or in your district. How do you earn a place at the table? You come at them with credible data and with a particular unique perspective to offer on helping students achieve. And you can't advocate for students if we don't have jobs because of policies, funding changes, legislative priorities that aren't informed by school counseling research and outcomes. I did see a comment that talks about promoting school counselors' credibility when you're using this as a step towards other advocacy in terms of obtaining data from the school, the PTA, and so forth. That's the kind of thing you have to do. It's putting yourself in a position to be an effective advocate, even if there isn't a crisis or a particular issue to talk about. On one of the later slides, one of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you is some of the stuff that I actually do when I'm working as, on behalf of our faculty union and on behalf of education in general and higher education in Florida. One of my first things this year was after the election, I sent a congratulations letter to every one of the legislators, not telling them anything about what I'm going to be arguing with them about later in the session, but introducing myself as somebody who cares about education and higher education and school counseling in the state, and thanking them for their willingness to serve to solve difficult problems at the state level. So I'm trying to establish a relationship well in advance of when I know what the real issues are. To be in a position to advocate for students, you've got to be ensured that you've advocated for the profession. That's the bottom line. Remember, this is not about you personally. It's about policies and outcomes that make schools better for students. And when we make schools better for students, students are more likely to achieve. We keep coming back full circle to student achievement. So the questions on the next slides, which I'm not going to focus on a tremendous amount, is asking you to think about whether or not you're advocacy able. So there are some dispositions and skills listed here that we're not going to go over necessarily in great depth, but to think about the kinds of positions you put yourself in, the ways you think about working in your school and working on behalf of your students. In other words, do you have a willingness to eliminate inequities and fight barriers? Are you a caring professional? Do you value our code of ethics and act on it as much as possible in terms of advocacy? Do you think autonomously? Are you a little bit inclined to take risk? And by that I mean to identify and address unmet or underserved needs. In some schools where you have a small culture of people who have worked together for a long time, the person taking the risk may be the person who kind of is willing to step out front and say, the emperor is naked. And the things that there's an elephant in the room and we're not talking about it. Are you disposed towards working with families and empowering them and partnering with them? Do you know the resources inside and outside the school that you could call on to be a more effective advocate? Do you know the parameters and the context in which you're operating? Every policy that we try and change, every procedure that we work with, every funding issue that we try and address has a context. In an era of very limited funding, it's not effective to just go say, don't cut us. It's not effective to just say, we want things to stay as they are. It's more effective to say, if you cut us, this is what will go. How can we work with you to make sure that there are enough resources to keep this program and this issue alive? It's to go into a problem-solving mode. You have to know how to resolve disputes and how to talk to people who are disagreeable and who disagree. You have to know advocacy models. And advocacy models simply are problem-solving models with a lot of tips about how to work with other people. And as I mentioned before, use data and not only or leading with emotional arguments, because emotional arguments work on guilt, and guilt is not a very positive emotion to try and engender in people when you're trying to get them on your side and persuade them that they agree with you and that they want to get out in front and help you achieve your particular advocacy goal. You have to know about change, and you have to understand that change is hard for many people, and change is particularly hard for systems. So it may be a step-by-step process that you're facilitating, and you need to know how to partner across subsystems. Have partners with parents, key people on the school's advisory board. Know how to reach out to school board members and to how to disagree with them sometimes and still remain colleagues and professional. We're looking at 3 core skills: the degree to which you can communicate, the degree to which you can empathize within communication, because the better you can empathize with people who don't agree with you, the better you will be able to talk to them in their terms to be able to be persuasive. The degree to which you can be a collaborator, and are you open-minded and a fairly assertive problem solver? Can you engage in good problem-solving activities that are positive and engage other people to be empowered as problem solvers? But for school counselors, there are some challenges that we have to face. And some of it is, like Pogo used to say, I have met the enemy and it is us. School counselors tend to be people who move towards helping. They tend to move towards conformity and wanting to fit in, and they tend to move towards compromise. Those 3 tendencies that we have as professional tendencies tend to be barriers to us being leaders and autonomous thinkers, taking risks, and engaging in more objective analysis. Most new educators get brought into a school and they become fairly obedient and conforming rather than independent. So as an individual school counselor moves into a school to try and fit in, very often what they will do is fit in by agreeing with what everybody has to say and conforming, rather than coming in and saying, I'm looking at the data in this school and this is what it says to me. And there are some changes we could make which would make things much better for everybody. Plus, as I mentioned more than once before, we are biased towards emotional and personal issues and arguments, and that can often work against effective advocacy for us. We're often bent not towards working with and presenting data. At this point in our professional careers and in the history of our profession, we can no longer just say we don't like working with and presenting data. The time is now. If you're not comfortable with data, get comfortable with data. Sometimes we have trouble balancing the need to be collaborative with the need to be assertive and self-confident. And many schools and districts don't promote autonomy and assertive advocacy. They don't want to hear that the emperor's naked. They don't want to know that there's an elephant in the room. So the model that you'll see, and this is one that I pulled together from several sources, within the last 10 years have promoted this model for advocacy, and it's a pretty simple model. It talks about making sure that you have the appropriate professional identity and the skill set that we talked about before, those dispositions and skills that I listed. Make sure that you have sufficient collaborative relationships with decision makers and resource people and partners before you have a crisis. And certainly you can continue to build partnerships after you have one, but the most effective time is before. Define the problem based on data. Don't just, look around and say, what could I think of as being wrong in my community? Look at data and be able to share that data. The minute you use data to define the problem, you are beginning to predict a good way of defining the goals. Develop some clear and specific solutions and action plans. The solutions are the things you're going to try and advocate for. Don't go to people and say, we have a big problem, without some ideas about how we could get together and either make the solution happen or begin to form the solution together. And have some action plans that you can follow through on and implement. When you implement your action plans, use the best of your skills, particularly your communication, problem solving, and dispute resolution skills. You're going to need to use your coordination talents to make sure that your partners are doing their job and you can do your job in terms of achieving your goal. Evaluate your effectiveness. At some point, you're going to make one of those gambler decisions. I'm going to persist, I'm going to regroup and reframe, or I'm going to fold. And I'm going to decide that my efforts would be better placed into other activities at this point. And if you're successful, celebrate. If you're not successful, regroup. We're looking at developing a goal, a sense of the benefits and projected outcomes for making such a change. Make sure you have relationships and that you've identified your potential partner resources who are natural allies and beneficiaries for change. And do not overlook parents and PTOs. Very often we have worked with parents as school counselors over time and with our PTOs over time. And if we're not looking at them as natural partners, I don't know who our natural partners are. Understanding the risks and costs involved in change. You also have to talk to people about the risk of not changing or not addressing the problem. Very often when we're advocating, what we do is we paint the picture of this, we paint this rosy picture of what's going to happen if we get the change we want. And people either say, that's a very nice picture, but we can't afford it, or maybe they move towards that picture. But they also don't create the appropriate sense of urgency of, if we don't make this change, this is what we're risking. If we do not change the patterns of funding to allow school counselors to continue doing what they're doing or to do more of what they're doing, students will not necessarily have the support they need to access higher education or post-secondary education and work options. Students may not be able to apply for financial aid and scholarships appropriately, which will reduce their access and their success. Students will not have the behaviors they need, and so forth. So, I'm seeing a question here that asks me about the graduation rate, that the graduation rate was mentioned earlier. Lots of examples of data to target. You can look at attendance rate. You can look at the percentage of students who are on task in terms of their classroom grades. You can look at behavior. You can look at in and out of school suspensions. You can look at the pupil progression plans and seeing how pupils will progress under certain conditions or others. There's lots and lots of data, and that's actually a different webinar in terms of how to target data and the kinds of data and the factors that we particularly impact. But it's very important to understand the risk and the cost. If you don't agree with me, that's fine, but this is what you could be risking. So don't just paint a rosy picture of what you want. Also create a sense of urgency that they have to make a choice. Reach out, collaborate, Mentioned before, finding natural partners. Manage those collaborative relationships. Make sure you're keeping effective communication, trust, respect, and using past positive relationships and build on those. Develop an advocacy strategy that's aimed at stakeholders and at policymakers. Don't try and just advocating to the choir, because then you're going to have a larger group of people who agree but who don't have the power to make change. One of the things that we talk about very often with system change is to start small and to build up and out. So we may start a project, we get a pilot project. Pilot project is successful. We grow that into higher grades. We grow that into more classrooms. We grow that into more schools. So there's some examples that I just wanted to run through and to talk about different forms of advocacy. We mentioned before the advocacy for the individual student. And each of you who's listening to this has done this dozens of times. So this is really more of a review. But an individual student may need an exception to a rule, a special placement, a change in circumstances, or to move to a different classroom. Even though it's not the teacher's fault or the student's fault, something is not connecting and the student would be more successful in a different environment. So we have to identify, the first thing we have to do is, what's the desired outcome? And who can make it happen? That helps us set our goal and our plan. Build our case based on data. Okay? Build a picture of your desired outcome. In this case, the data, the example I got, the data target, student attendance rate, that the student in this particular class, the minute they got to this math teacher in this class, they suddenly are absent 30 and 40 days in a semester, rather than last year when they were only absent 8 days in a semester, and there's no health changes. That's good data, and it may be attendance data, there may be behavior data, rate of submitting homework, so forth. So what's the picture of the desired outcomes? What's the cost of making the change? Is it a human cost? Does somebody have to work harder, invest differently in that student? Is there a financial change? Is there a legal cost? An achievement cost? Okay. Also, again, what are the costs of not making it happen? And then make a plan. What are our options? We can leave the child in the class, but coach the teacher. We can move the child to a different class with some supports. We can, create new solutions that will empower the child to be more successful. Get potential partners, implement your plan, and again, evaluate, reform, reframe, and evaluate again. So the decision maker says, I'm not moving this child into another classroom. The other classrooms are overloaded. I don't want to set the example of too many students leaving their environment and leaving their classrooms, so they're going to have to stay in that classroom. We have to look at other options. We may need to reframe and reform this so that we can change the situation for that child, but the particular option we were going for wasn't effective. For a group of students, and this example has been used by ASCA a lot, and it's part of why I chose it, because there's even some data around to think about this. But students who are being systematically placed into less challenging classes because there is a rigid teacher-only recommendation process. And this is about systemic change. So can you identify the data of class-taking patterns on a disaggregated basis? Are we disadvantaging one group of students, one gender, students of a particular socioeconomic group, or in a particular grade? Identify the exceptions of success. Of the students who didn't get a teacher-only recommendation, who fought their way into a class, how successful were they? Identify the incentives in law or in public opinion to make the change. Identify the stakeholders. Who benefits from this? What students benefit from this? What teachers benefit from this? And what families benefit from this? Help them, have you help you identify your alternatives and develop a plan. You can use group meetings, you can use focus groups Focus groups, by the way, are brief and targeted qualitative research activities, which translates into a preset set of questions and notes that you take to flesh out survey data or other kinds of things about how people think and feel about a particular issue. You may research other empirically based or best practices, link with listservs, collaborate with state programs in terms of who the stakeholders might be. Develop a pilot program if that's what you have to do with a smaller group of faculty or with only one department. Pre-test it and develop outcome results. Then expand what works and tinker with what didn't. Always come back to the evaluate and move forward and recycle where you've been. Advocacy for the profession. Okay, and this particular example is very real, and we've seen it over time in many ways in many districts, and we may be seeing it again coming very soon. And that is a legislative task force is considering saving money by shifting non-counseling jobs to school counselors. So one of the things I want you to remember here is that when the state or federal legislature takes action, we feel it at the local level, especially with more delegated and site-based decision-making. So sometimes we want to engage people to really write to their legislators and let them know what they think, but make sure in advance of that decision we have already laid the groundwork with our local decision makers, because this year in the state of Florida, if the legislature cuts the school budget, they're not going to cut particular positions. The districts and building level people are going to cut those positions. So the time to be advocating and to be credible and to have your data in order and to build your relationships with policymakers at the building and district level is now, as they're thinking about taking these actions. So you need to develop two pictures. One that's what's the model and the possibilities with school counseling, as it should be, and what are the potential outcomes for students and schools if this is implemented and you can't do school counseling as it should be. What's the risk of the action? What's the risk of not taking the action? What do you get in both scenarios? And ask key questions. What's the current data about student performance and achievement? That's where you are now. What's going to change if they change the way school counselors function? How will those outcomes be changed and with less school counseling time or smaller school counseling program? What are you going to remove, and how will that change the experience and achievement, academic achievement of students? If you're not successful, what are the possibilities for increasing student achievement in the face of fewer school counseling hours for students? So the lessons are to collaborate early and often. The time to develop partnerships is not when you will need them, but throughout your work. Okay, it's a very interesting, when I'm teaching legal and ethical issues, I use a wonderful piece from Aesop's Fable about the lion and the fox. And at one point they come together and I'm sorry, that's the lion and the wild boar. There are two of them that I use. The wild boar is sharpening his tusks, and there's nothing going on. He's well fed. There's no other animals around. Absolutely nothing is going on that would suggest that he needs to be ready to fight. And the lion says, "Why are you bothering to work so hard sharpening your tusks? You've just eaten. There's no animals that you're going to need to kill, and there's nothing that's going to attack you." And the wild boar simply says, "I won't have time to sharpen my tusks when the need arises." And that's the same thing in terms of collaboration, finding partners, and advocacy. You won't have time to get organized and to make the partnerships you need when the crisis hits. So make sure that you're doing this throughout your work. But in general, collaborate with other stakeholders to answer your questions, outline your pictures, outline your goals. Develop alternative strategies to solve the money problem. Reframe the problem differently. Look at it differently. Settle on an approach that everybody can believe in and follow, or at least that most people can believe in. I'm engaging right now in what's called interest-based bargaining, sometimes called win-win bargaining. And we work, when we approve something at the table, on the principle of 70-100. And that is 100% of the people agree with this at least 70% of the time. So we have enough agreement to move forward, even if everybody doesn't love it. Don't wait for the all-purpose perfect solution, because you're never going to find it. Find the solution that you can get behind, is workable, is feasible, and is explainable, and move forward from there. And begin moving forward. As I mentioned before, think globally but act locally. Think about the impact of what's going on in Tallahassee and in Washington or in your downtown office, and then begin to build your coalitions on a very small level in your school and continue to build up and out from there. Reach out to important partners, parents, local and state professional organizations. On the behalf of its members, FISCA is now going to be partnering with the social workers and school psychologists because we all have common interests in terms of this year's crises. Okay? Reach out to the unions. If you're not a member of your union, you may want to consider becoming a member of your union because it's Florida Education Association that actually worked the hardest to defeat Senate Bill 6 last year. They are partnering with FISCA and providing some resources to us right now to help us stay at the table in the onslaught of changes that we're contemplating. Think about what the financial resources are that you'll need. Do you have any sponsors or any people who believe in your cause enough to help you take out an ad, to print flyers, to do other things, to travel to Tallahassee to lobby if that's what's needed? And figure out what your technologies are. What are the technologies that you will need, whether they be web-based, doing webinars, or having group discussions like this, using Skype to get small core of people moving and acting and working in a committee? Email addresses, an email system, an alert system. What do you need to flesh out that plan, and who's going to do each thing? Match your activities to the resources you've got. Make sure that you can figure out what needed resources you have to go out and look for them. Figure out what your materials are. And the public to your side. Keep building on people who are your partners and who have a common interest and a stakeholder interest in what you're doing. Build momentum. Develop the relationships with your local legislative delegation. If you don't go with the whole delegation, and by that I mean the people who represent all of the areas that are covered by your district, at least the person that you get to vote for. If you want to find out who your personal delegation is, you can go onto the website that I've got listed, and you just put in your address and your zip code, and it will give you everybody from the federal to the local level that you vote for one job or another. Introduce yourself in general and early in the session, and maybe before you know what the specific issues and concerns are. But develop that relationship so that when you make a phone call or you go to see them in their local office and you make an appointment with them, they recognize your name. You're not a stranger and you're not unknown to them. Implement your plan. Keep in touch with local and state partners. Learn from their strategies. Don't reinvent the wheel. I am very big on reading everybody else's advocacy positions and websites and strategies and trying to incorporate those into our own. Adapt things to our local situation. Bring others along. Find a role for people. Include everybody. Engage non-professionals and set an example. Call and write your personal legislators, always using home emails and cell phones, and tell them where you stand. Brief, focused message. I am a voter in your district. I am also a school counselor. I am very concerned about the lack of specificity in Senator Wise's bill in terms of how this is going to impact school counselors in the future and our profession and our ability to help children. Thank you for considering my opinion. Hang up. Do not use school emails. Do not use school computers. Do not use school telephones to do any of that. And always evaluate, reframe, adjust, and persist. Bunch of practical advocacy tips on the subsequent slides here. Use objective problem and goal statements. When you go at people with the following choice of goal statements, what do you think is going to be more effective in terms of gathering their support? We need to establish more career elective courses that are attractive to students from African American and Latino groups, or the average number of career courses taken over 4 years is 4.25 for white students, and averages for African American and Latino students are 1.0 and 0.75. The second statement makes a very strong and objective argument based on data that we are not being effective in attracting those students. It also implies a more objective and immediately measurable goal. Have a tight focus and a targeted argument. You're going to have a lot of good arguments for what you're going to try and accomplish. Choose among them to find the most focused, the most easy to understand, the one that has data to support it, and thus will be most compelling. Don't send an email that has every possible argument listed because they won't read it. They won't listen to the phone message. When a legislator's aide listens to the messages or reads their email, and believe me, mostly it's aides that do that, they are listening just enough to be able to fill in on the chart. We got 75 phone calls about this particular piece of legislation today. 38 of them were in favor and 37 of them were not. So if you have a 20-minute message on their answering machine, unless you stated your particular position at the beginning, you're not going to be heard. Same thing in an email. Use a kind of test to pre-test an issue. Is your reason for change compelling? Can a viable solution be attained? Is your proposed solution real, rational? Does it reflect appropriate boundaries? Have you factored out enough of the emotional factors that are going to make people feel bad about this rather than to engage in understanding your position? This is different from having a passion for your cause. This is about using only emotional arguments that will cause a win-lose. And if you're not the policymaker, more than likely you're the one who's going to lose. Do you have a clear picture of the outcomes and the benefits and the risk of change? The benefits of change and the risk of non-changing. I see that we've been asked about printing out this particular PowerPoint, and I believe this is going to appear on the fiscal website. It's okay with me that this is going to appear on the fiscal website, and this is being recorded to use later. So we are recording this webinar. Thanks for the question. It's important that we raise that. More tips. Some of you know that I like to use solution-focused strategies in problem solving in leadership, in organizational development, as well as in counseling. And one of the things that we need to really think about is develop detailed action plans based on what has worked before, rather than assuming that any plan is going to work. So if you can observe what other people have done in successful advocacy, use that. If you've been successful in making change, use the elements that you think were most effective. Take different perspectives on problems and solutions that may lead to effective action planning and problem solving. Don't get mired just in one view of the problem, because you're going to tend to do more of what I call admiring the problem, which is describing it, rather than being able to see it from a number of the perspectives that will give you more solution strategies. Focus on strengths, solution, and change rather than on the difficulties from the past. Develop a culture of advocacy. Work with people who are willing to take risks, who have courage, and who are persistent. Have a clear picture of where you're going to ensure that you're going to get there. If you don't know what it's going to look like and you can't communicate that, I don't know how in the world you're going to plan on getting there. And build in accountability. At every step of your plan, know when you have done enough to move on to the next step. Know when you have reached out enough, when you have made enough of your change. How much will be enough for you to consider it successful? In terms of partnerships and coalitions, we've talked about the first bullet enough. Partnerships are the key to rapid, irreversible change. The more people on board, the quicker you're going to be able to make change and get it to stick. Identify who the key partners are for school change, and identify the different partners who may be available for systemic and policy change. Don't ignore the DOE at the state, district advisory boards, state associations, Department of Labor's, Allied Student Services professionals, and higher education. Partnerships that result in a living, functional state school counseling model is going to be the most effective. And partnership building is a complex process and takes time. That's why you start yesterday if you possibly can. More tips. Make sure your organizational skills are sharp, that you can collect, analyze, and present data, that you can plan and organize action on multiple fronts, that you are managing the advocacy process, not just throwing something out there and hoping that everybody takes a part of it, that you're coordinating human resources effectively, knowing who your allies are, and making use of the skills that you don't have that other people may have. Identify your adversaries and resources and begin to prepare counterarguments to their resistance. Facilitate advocacy in a very systematic and organized way. If you just keep sending out alerts and you're not giving people a way of organizing their thinking and moving forward from those alerts, all you're doing is scaring people. You're not empowering them to take reasonable and good action. Remember that advocacy is about change, and that may start with you and your methods. Solution-focused rule: if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten. If you want something to change, you may have to change. You may have to think about something differently. You may have to be a different kind of leader. You may have to step back and not be out front in something and let somebody else be out front. Accept that change is the status quo. Be prepared for it. Be willing to learn and implement new ways of doing things. Understand what the big picture is and how you fit into it. Make a way out of no way. Contribute to the primary goals of the organization. Always link your goal to the primary goals of policymakers and show them how there's a direct connection. Be reflective and examine your goals. If it's becoming about you keeping your job, that's not going to work, and you're not going to be very effective in engaging partners to work for you to keep your job. If it's about connecting to the school's achievement and success and student success, then you're able to talk about doing the right thing, making sure that your attitudes and values are really driving appropriate choices and behaviors, that you can challenge yourself beyond what your perceived limits are, and that you're willing to be accountable. Leadership becomes advocacy very quickly. When we're doing the right thing, when we're engaging partners, when we're managing change, when we're identifying unmet needs and then beginning to build a coalition and a plan to meet those needs, we are moving from leaders into advocates. So the best preparation for being a strong advocate is to have a strong program to begin with that has points of success and data that you can share. Take assertive action to support students. Always make it about the student and not about you, and not about your opponents, and not about the people who are resisting it. It can't be personal. Have results. Deliberate actions that can be documented by hard data. Moving school counseling from the periphery edge to be front and center in trying to define student success. Advocacy also involves self-care, because anytime you're talking about engaging in assertive action, courage, and risk-taking, you also are talking about needing to have a support system, coping skills for disappointments, good boundaries, and good support to make sure that you're not personalizing things more than they should be. Using good cognitive behavioral strategies to avoid personalizing defeat and disagreements. And to be able to reframe personal failure into one of inappropriately deployed skills. Maybe I didn't plan well enough. A valiant best effort. I did the best I could with what I had. A growth experience. I'm never going to do it quite this way again. And a successful start towards new change and a new direction. Make sure that you have partners that engage in mutual support. So at the end of a very strenuous advocacy period, that you come back together and celebrate each other, thank each other, recognize the efforts of everybody, talk about how we're going to move forward together, what we've learned about this, what we've learned about each other, and continue to build that mutual support. And as I started, I will end. It starts and ends with students' achievement. It starts and ends with you. We cannot expect other people to advocate for us personally, for our profession, for our program, any harder than we're willing to do. Why should they? I recently have, in my union hat, recently sent something out to people saying many of you have been relying on the good wishes and the good graces of everybody else who has joined the union to protect your rights. Now we're at a point with proposed legislation where no matter how many of us are willing to do that, if more than 50% of us don't do it, then we have nothing. It's not that we can get more, and more is always better. Now we need enough. And each person individually has to take some responsibility for making sure that we have enough. Expecting teachers to come out and advocate for you, or building principals because they like you, or parents have had a good experience with school counselors to come out and start fighting for you without you advocating and organizing and being out there, it's not going to happen. So advocacy always starts with you. And with that, we are at about the end of our process. It's just about 2 o'clock. Any questions besides the few questions that I've seen about being able to access this information and or this webinar on the fiscal website in the future? Thank you, Melissa, for the note about it being an awesome job. I appreciate that. This is my first one, so that's helpful to me. With that, then, I'm going to sign off, and we're going to stop the recording and discontinue the webinar. You can reach me through FSCA's advocacy site. You can also reach me at Florida Gulf Coast University. I encourage each of you to contact your local school counseling association, stay in touch with FSCA, and get busy. And do